Nobody in Colby Ridge had planted anything in the Northeast 40 in 6 years, and 13-year-old Marlo Ansel was out there anyway, on her knees in the cracked, pale dirt, burying kitchen scraps in a hole she dug with a hand trowel. Her father had walked past twice that week without asking what she was doing. By the third time, he stopped the truck. If quiet stubbornness and the wisdom hidden in ordinary things move you, subscribe and join us every week. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel. The Ansel farm sat in the rolling wheat country of north-central Kansas, 600 acres that had supported 3 generations of the family through droughts, floods, and every kind of bad luck in between. But the Northeast 40, everyone in the family just called it the dead field by that point, had been a different story entirely. Marlo's father, Grant Ansel, had planted it in continuous wheat for over a decade before the yield started dropping so sharply that eventually the math simply stopped making sense. Fertilizer costs climbing every year while the field produced less and less, the soil turning pale and powdery, cracking in dry weather in patterns that looked, from a distance, almost like a dried-up lakebed.
Grant had finally given up on the Northeast 46 years earlier, letting it sit fallow, occasionally mowing the volunteer weeds that grew there but otherwise treating it as land the farm simply couldn't use anymore. Marlo's mother, Denise, ran a small farm stand business selling eggs and preserves out of a converted shed near the road, and had, over the years, developed a genuine interest in soil health that mostly went nowhere given how busy the actual working acreage kept her. Marlo had one older brother, Cody, 16, who mostly stayed out of farm decisions entirely, and one grandmother, Ruth, 73, who lived in the original farmhouse and remembered, better than anyone, what that particular field had looked like before the trouble started. It was Ruth who first mentioned to Marlo, almost offhand one afternoon that spring, that the Northeast 40 hadn't always been the way it was now. That ground used to be some of the best on this whole farm, Ruth told her, the two of them sitting on the porch looking out toward the pale, cracked field in the distance. Your grandfather rotated crops through there, wheat, then clover, then back to wheat. Kept animals grazing it some seasons too. Ground had life in it back then. Your father's generation started planting the same thing year after year because it was simpler, and simpler made sense for a long while until it didn't anymore. Marlo had heard the phrase, the dead field, her whole life without really thinking about what it actually meant. That conversation with Ruth sent her looking for real answers, starting with library books on soil science and, eventually, agricultural extension pamphlets Denise had accumulated over the years without ever quite finding the time to read them all. Here's what Marlo began to understand over the following weeks. Continuous monoculture, planting the exact same crop in the same ground year after year without rotation, depleted specific soil nutrients in a predictable, cumulative pattern, while also allowing crop-specific pests and diseases to build up in the soil undisturbed. Worse, without any organic matter being returned to the ground, the soil's actual structure degraded over time, losing the crumbly, absorbent texture that let it hold water and support healthy root systems, collapsing instead into the pale, compacted, cracking dirt Marlo saw every time she walked past the Northeast 40. The field wasn't dead in any permanent sense. It was exhausted, stripped of the specific things it needed, and, according to everything Marlo was reading, capable of recovering given patient, deliberate treatment over several seasons rather than a single quick fix. She brought the idea to her father on a Sunday evening, printouts and library book pages spread across the kitchen table. We tried rotating that ground for a while, way back, Grant told her, more tired than dismissive. By the time I took it over, it was already struggling. I didn't have the years to spare experimenting with it while the rest of the farm needed attention. Easier to just let it sit. What if I did the experimenting? Marlo asked. Not the whole 40 acres. Just a test section. If it doesn't work, we've lost nothing we weren't already losing by leaving it fallow. Grant didn't say yes immediately, but he didn't say no either, which Marlo had learned over the years usually meant permission to find out for herself. The actual work started small, and it started with garbage. Marlo began composting in earnest that spring. Not just kitchen scraps, but grass clippings, old hay, chicken manure from Denise's small flock, anything organic she could get her hands on, building a rough compost pile behind the equipment shed using pallets for walls, turning it by hand with a pitchfork every week whether it looked like it needed it or not, sweating through her shirt in the early summer heat as she worked the pile over, checking its internal temperature with an old meat thermometer to make sure it was actually breaking down properly rather than just sitting there. Her first batch came out wrong, too dry, breaking down too slowly, the internal temperature never climbing high enough to actually kill weed seeds and pathogens the way proper composting was supposed to. She'd read enough by then to diagnose the problem. Not enough moisture, not enough nitrogen-rich material mixed with the dry carbon-heavy stuff. She started again, adjusting the ratios, hauling water out to the pile by bucket during dry stretches, mixing in more manure, turning it more frequently, her hands blistered from the pitchfork handle by the second month. By midsummer, she had a genuinely working compost system, dark, crumbly, earthy-smelling material that looked nothing like the pale dirt it was meant to fix. She spread the first batch across a single test acre of the Northeast 40 that August, working alone after school most days, wheelbarrowing load after load out to the field and spreading it by hand with a rake, the physical labor of it dwarfing anything she'd expected when she'd first started the project. That fall, instead of planting wheat again on the test acre, she planted a cover crop of clover, following Ruth's memory of the old rotation and confirming the choice against everything the extension pamphlets recommended for rebuilding depleted soil nitrogen. The clover came up thin and patchy at first, struggling in soil that was still, fundamentally, exhausted, but it held on through the fall and Marlo watched it carefully, checking soil moisture and color every week, comparing her test acre against the untouched dead field surrounding it. Winter brought its own complication. An early, hard freeze in November killed back more of the young clover than Marlo had expected, leaving bare patches across nearly a third of her test acre. She spent a cold December weekend reseeding those bare patches by hand, working in a coat and gloves that made the delicate work of pressing seeds into soil awkward and slow, her fingers numb by the end of each session. Ruth, watching her granddaughter's dogged persistence through that first hard winter, mentioned something Marlo hadn't considered. Your grandfather used to graze cattle on the clover field some seasons. Not just let it grow untouched, Ruth said. Animals add their own manure right back into the ground while they're working the clover down. Might speed things along, if you had a way to fence off that test acre and run a few head through it come spring. Marlo brought this to her father again that winter and Grant, watching his daughter's project survive its first real test, agreed to let her borrow 4 head of cattle from the farm's main herd for 2 weeks that spring, fencing off the test acre with temporary electric fencing Marlo set up herself, learning wire tension and fence charger installation through trial and error, getting shocked twice before she figured out how to properly ground the system. The cattle grazed the clover down over those 2 weeks, adding their own manure to the ground exactly as Ruth had predicted, and when Marlo pulled soil samples that following June, sending them to the extension office for proper lab testing rather than relying on guesswork, the results showed measurable improvement in organic matter content and nitrogen levels compared to samples taken from the untouched surrounding field. It wasn't dramatic. It was a modest, real, measurable step in the right direction, exactly the kind of incremental progress that took patience most 13-year-olds didn't have much practice with. By the following fall, 2 full growing seasons into the project, Marlo planted wheat on her test acre for the first time since the whole experiment began, following the same rotation pattern Ruth remembered from decades earlier, treating the soil as something still recovering rather than something to push hard for maximum yield right away. The wheat came up healthier than anything the surrounding dead field had produced in years, not spectacular by any working farm standards, but a visible, unmistakable contrast to the pale, struggling growth on the untouched acres just beyond her test plot's fence line. Grant walked the test acre with Marlo that harvest, comparing the wheat stand's density and color against the rest of the field, running his hand along stalks that stood noticeably greener and fuller than anything he'd expected from that particular piece of ground in years. How long before the rest of it could look like this? He asked. 3 years, maybe, for if we did the whole 40 the same way, Marlo said. Compost, clover rotation, some grazing. Takes longer than just planting wheat every year. But it actually builds something instead of just using it up. Grant stood there a long moment, doing the kind of calculation a practical farmer does when reconsidering an assumption he'd made years earlier. What would it take to do the whole field? He asked. What followed over the next 3 years was a gradual, expanding version of Marlo's original experiment, section by section. The Northeast 40 brought back into rotation using compost. Marlo scaled up significantly with help from Cody, who'd started pitching in more seriously once he saw the test acre's actual results, and clover grazing cycles that Grant now planned into the farm's broader cattle rotation rather than treating as a separate experimental sideline. By the time the whole 40 acres had cycled through at least one full rotation, soil tests across the field showed organic matter content nearly doubled from where it had started, and that year's wheat harvest, while still not matching the farm's best working ground, produced yields close to double what the field had managed in its final declining years before Grant originally gave up on it. Word spread through the local farming community the way it always did, and Denise, who'd developed her own quiet interest in soil health years earlier without ever finding time to act on it, started incorporating some of what Marlo had learned into her own small garden plots behind the farm stand. The two of them now comparing notes regularly in a way that had become one of the more unexpected outcomes of the whole project. Ruth, watching all of this unfold from her porch over those 3 years, found herself thinking often about how much of what Marlo had rebuilt was, at its core, simply a return to knowledge Ruth herself had carried for decades without anyone in the younger generations particularly caring to ask her about it. Your grandfather would have been glad to see it work the way he always figured it should, Ruth told Marlo that final harvest, the two of them looking out over wheat that, 6 years earlier, nobody in the family had believed that ground could ever produce again. Wendell Berry once wrote that the soil is the great connector of our lives, the source and destination of all. Marlo hadn't set out to prove her father wrong about a decision that had, by every reasonable measure available to him at the time, made sense. She'd set out because a single offhand comment from her grandmother had made her wonder whether dead and exhausted were actually the same thing, and she'd been patient enough to spend 3 years finding out the difference with a pitchfork, a compost pile, and for borrowed cattle. Marlo is 16 now. The Northeast 40 has become, in her father's words, some of the most carefully managed ground on the whole farm, rotated and rested on a schedule Marlo helped design and now helps maintain alongside her regular schoolwork. She's already started talking with Grant about applying similar principles to a second, smaller section of declining ground on the farm's western edge, treating the whole approach now less as a one-time rescue and more as simply how the family thinks about soil going forward. What's something in your own life that everyone assumed was permanently used up, that turned out to just need patient, deliberate care instead of being written off entirely? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. And if stories like this one mean something to you, subscribe. We'd love to have you along.